How much did you learn in school about Britain's colonial history?
Not much. Okay, so I had my schooling in Grenada, primary and secondary. I learned a lot about the kings and queens of England. Not very much about the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. Not very much about the Caribbean either.
Nothing. I didn't really learn much. I don't think I learned, I only learned about slavery or enslavement. It's not something that was prioritized in my education, even though I went to a predominantly black school as well. So I don't think it was a conversation that was willing to be had, especially at primary school level or secondary school level. And I think about my history classes, it was just definitely all white. I hated history, but I love history now.
How to say? I think there's a lot more to learn, you know? Like, we get the headlines are passed on to us. It's probably through music that I've learned the most, to be honest. I've never been to the Caribbean myself. It's hard to even separate Britain's colonialism in the Caribbean because, you know, I think feel very strongly that it was the Caribbean that made Britain, you know, especially if you see Britain today. The two, you can't really separate the two out. Obviously, the fact that the Caribbean is populated by African people is because of the colonialism in the first place, but the fact that Britain has what it is today is because of the contribution of Caribbean people to this country. So, yeah, I think we got to learn more. Obviously, a lot of the history, I think, has been destroyed and covered over.
I think we learn a very limited and also not only limited but distorted understanding of Britain's colonial history. Not only that, I think there's also a totally distorted understanding and a white supremacist understanding of how we see people, you know, African people, but also all indigenous peoples, you know. There's a way to look down on it, even if you're a diaspora, you know, it's to look down on your own people, to feel like you're in a better place because you're here in the West, you know, and that your people are back home in a worse situation, when really there's a lot of richness and there's a culture that you never even knew about. So I think there's a lot that we don't understand, you know, and it takes a lot to be able to repair that lack of understanding, not only at an intellectual level, but also at an emotional and as a human level, you know, which is really important, and why education is one of the fundamental aspects of reparations.
The education system in this country needs to do a hell of a lot more, and I'll come back to that. The education system in the Caribbean needs to do a lot more. The education system on the African continent needs to do a lot more.
My name is John Dower, and I'm the great-grandson of Charles Phillips Trevelyan, which will become, you know, useful, I think, in terms of the story I'm probably about to tell. I am a film, TV and games director, so I went to film school and direct TV drama, games cutscenes and short films. I had always been told by my family, by my grandmother particular, that we came from this noble family, not in terms of money, but in terms of public service. So my great-grandfather was in the Labour Party. He was in the first education minister in the first Labour Party cabinet in the 1920s. His brother was G.M. Trevelyan, who was an eminent historian. My father particularly was very much worked in public service. And any time that anyone mentioned in the family that they ever talked about enslavement or plantations, they always talked about abolition, because we had friends in the family who were involved in abolition. So I always kind of had this idea that we were on the side of the good guys. So in 2016, I read an article in The Guardian by David Olusoga, the eminent historian, and it says, if you are a middle-class person or you're descended from the landed gentry, you should check out the UCL Legacies of Slavery database. And I thought, oh, okay, well, I'll try it. So I went to the database, typed in the name Trevelyan, bang,
In other words, our histories are intertwined, okay?
6 of my ancestors, 6 generations above me, owned, in inverted commas, 1,004 enslaved people and got compensation to the tune of, well, they shared it with other families, but they got thousands of pounds of compensation, which would be, in today's money, be worth millions. And my life just literally changed because suddenly the idea of who I thought I was completely wrong. And that really started a real process for me. So that began in 2016. My emotional response was immediate one of anger. I felt as though I'd been lied to. I felt like my family were hypocrites. I felt like my grandmother had given me this notion that I was one thing. I was a person who should be proud of his family's heritage, and suddenly I wasn't. So emotionally I was absolutely furious, and that led then to shame. I felt shame. And when I started doing something about it, I went into action, that changed. And I think I began to feel as though I was on some sort of, I had duty and I had purpose.
I think the UK government should engage with reparations, particularly in the field of education, because they established, if you like, the academic curricula and also many of the initial, very early schools that sort of became the models, if you like, for the British education system with the proceeds of enslavement. Many of these were set up by merchants. In Liverpool, for instance, we had the Blue Coat School, which was set up by in the 1700s by a slave trader and the church. The Liverpool Royal Institution was set up by a group of enslavers that actually enslaved my ancestors in Demerara, and they used the proceeds of Demerara sugar cultivation to establish the Liverpool Royal Institution, which is today Liverpool University. There was the Liverpool Mechanics Institute, which is today John Moores University. There was the Manchester Mechanics Institute, which is today Manchester University. There was Newnham College in Cambridge, which was the first women's college in Cambridge. There was Manchester College, Oxford. And there were so many more schools and institutes of knowledge production that were funded by enslavers with the proceeds of their enslavement. And the very fabric of the academic system that we have today was crafted by them with those proceeds. So they have a duty and a responsibility to make restitution for that.
I think the education system is failing to teach us Black history in a meaningful way. But I think if we interrogate the way the education system is set up, that shouldn't surprise us, because it's a system, to train people to keep running the broader system that we live in, Like, whose education system do we sit in? And, even when they do start teaching us about Black history, they teach it in a particular way, I think there's 2 ways that the education system can let us down. One, in a very direct way, they don't teach us about Black history at all. But there's a second way, which I think is also very dangerous, where they like to try and tell us what Black history is, but in a very pacified and kind of twisted narrative that acts like, what went wrong was in the past and everything's been sorted out now, is the way they try and teach us. So, yeah, I would like to see our people have more of a foothold and be able to take back space in the education system. But that system itself, I don't trust it to teach us about our history.
I think my education came a bit from uni, came a bit from my parents in a way. I think probably my mum's side more have a lot of knowledge about our African ancestry. And I think I was very fortunate to experience that through not only going to Saturday school, but just through the kind of teachings that my grandma would pass down to my mum and mum would pass to me. But a lot of my education actually started with music. So music education played a huge role when I was 17, 18. I was still on road, not really yet in college, but it was giving me a sense of what justice looked like. So I was listening to a lot of reggae, and reggae speaks to the heart of, repatriation. It speaks to the heart of reparation. A lot of the facts of Black history are kind of within a lot of the old school sounds. And I think for me, that's probably where my education really started. But then as it progressed, I would go on Black history walks, for example, around the UK, and then museums. That's part of it. It's not the full thing. But self-learning, I think, is the the biggest journey one could go on.
In April of last year, me and another 6 other representatives of families descended from the enslavers set up an organisation called Heirs of Slavery. And our prime focus is to try and encourage other families, other descendants of enslavers, to come forward and do something about it. So, research their family history and learn about that so they're honest about it. And next, get involved in reparatory justice. So I don't think necessarily it's the government's responsibility to tell us what to do. I think we need to be doing that amongst ourselves. But the government absolutely need to be doing something about it. Let's face it, this is all sanctioned by the government back in the day. It was all sanctioned by the Church of England. It was supported by families like mine, my ancestors. But the government absolutely need to get involved. So that's another one of the things that we say with heirs of slavery, which is we believe that the government needs to get involved. And we're not talking necessarily about them taking on the 18 trillion the Brattle Group have talked about. That's a really good guide. But I think the most important thing that they should be doing is following the CARICOM 10-point plan, talking to CARICOM, talking to the diaspora here, talking to the African Union, talking to other leaders of the Commonwealth. And just get involved in conversation. I think apology is essential. I think it's number one in the CARICOM 10-point plan for a reason. But once that apology has been made, then they need to get involved in constructive conversation about what to do about it.
Well, the first thing I think they need to do is to start thinking seriously about repatriating wealth. Okay? We talk a lot about repatriation in terms of Africa's diaspora returning to the motherland. So people go from Jamaica, Grenada, Trinidad to Ethiopia or Ghana or wherever. And that's fine. But we need to think in terms of repatriation the other way around. Repatriating to those places the wealth that was created there. Because that wealth hasn't dried up. It's generational. And the descendants of people who owned endless plantations in the Caribbean and were compensated for the loss of property when enslavement was abolished, those descendants are still enjoying that wealth to this day. So it's a question of how we calibrate that to make sure that the wealth that was derived from those 400 years of enslavement and colonialism, it can be redistributed so that the dispossessed descendants of those enslaved ancestors could have better life chances.
I pictured a door with like loads of money just like flowing out. It just swept me away. So yeah, I feel like it is money for me. But I would also say on top of that, it's the space, the actual space to heal.
There's a lot that the UK government is not in a position to do, because like I said, I think reparations is fundamentally about our people doing it ourselves. But of course they got to pay up. But I think that's a small part of the story. They got to release the resources, because a lot of the archives, a lot of the information is still being held like in universities or in libraries in this country. So I think absolutely they have to open up the doors of all these institutions, of all these archives, so that we can access them. And I think they have to let go of where they're still controlling systems in the Caribbean and in Africa, where they're controlling legal systems, they're controlling education systems, they're controlling economic systems still, for example, through like the debt that they still impose on us. So I think they gotta back off, really, isn't it? And they gotta back off and give us the space to engage our history again and to actually find our own path of development. And that is what I think reparations really means, is returning to our own history.
I think education is absolutely at the centre of what needs to happen next, because the reason we've got to where we've got is because no one knows enough about this history. And I'm talking about school kids. This is why I think what black curriculum is so important, what they're doing is so important. School children need to understand their history. At the moment, they do not learn enough about colonialisation. They don't learn enough about the transatlantic trade. They don't learn enough about any of that stuff. And I certainly knew nothing about it. I mean, I've learned much more about the subject since knowing it in the last 8 years than I knew before that, which I think is really shameful. I should have known more, but I was never encouraged to learn it, and there was nothing out there really that I could grasp. And also, I didn't understand my family's involvement in it.
I think the UK has more than a responsibility, it's a moral duty to engage with the Caribbean because of the past that has been done and the repair that is needed. And I think the 10-point plan, which is something that is being driven by CARICOM, is really important, and that education to healthcare to debt cancellation is very key. So I think the UK has a huge responsibility there and can't ignore it. Like, if you know the history, then you can't ignore like what needs to happen.
What I would say to white people is education, essential, empathy and compassion. And one thing that I've learned since I've been doing this work is I've been talking to black people in a completely different way, on a completely different level. I've walked into rooms where I've encountered a lot of resentment, a lot of anger. I feel like I've been a lightning rod. In some ways I feel like I've been the representative in the room of my ancestors, because they've never seen a white person come and take any responsibility. So when we went to Grenada, particularly, that happened. I would like white people to try and understand what it must have been like to be an enslaved person. And that's really hard. So that's a challenge for all of us. How do we educate, inspire, give people the imagination of trying to understand what that was like? Because the trauma, I understand. I get the feeling that the trauma runs very deep, and I would like people to have some understanding of that. And I suppose that's about listening. That's about them just sitting there and actually listening, rather than, as many of them do now, they just dismiss it. So it's about listening, I think. That's what I'd like them to do.